Now, I'm going to say something that'll make me seem a little crazy, but I'm okay with that. I talk to myself sometimes. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Level Up with Lev. I am your host, Lev, and I'm bringing you the 5th episode in the first mini-season. Today I'll be discussing self-responsibility and self-accountability. And since those terms are both relatively self-explanatory, there won't be a lengthy introduction for this episode. Instead, I'll say that those are both two concepts that helped me to really steer my life in the direction that I wanted it to go. Today's episode will follow the following structure. First, I'll relate this episode to the previous episode regarding self-acceptance, then I'll discuss self-responsibility, followed by a conversation on self-accountability, and finally, I'll wrap up with some methods that I use to help employ these concepts in my life. Now, this is a nice transition from the previous episode where I discussed accepting myself by working on and working through issues from my past and integrating parts of myself that I didn't like in order to forge a healthier relationship with myself. Now, once I created this healthier relationship with myself that was founded on honesty, trust, and acceptance, it became much easier to grow because my foundation was stable and more durable. Now, at this point, since I established a more solid and stable foundation, it became evident that my next step was to tighten the reins and to establish some standards for future behavior in order to become the future version of myself that I wanted to become. In short, I started by identifying the type of behaviors that future Lev engages in and the type that he doesn't. In practice, this involved writing down my standards, my principles, my values, and then living by them. These include living according to truth, treating others with the same level of respect that I offer to them, which is usually a high level, doing what I can to make this experience better for others, putting my best effort into everything I do, and many more. And this was the perfect time to do so because I had created this newfound relationship with myself that was built on trust and communication, so I had more confidence in my ability to direct myself in one way or another. I could hold myself to a higher standard and push myself harder to go further due to the belief that I had in the sincerity of my intentions. And my intentions were, and always will be, to grow and improve as long as I live. Y'all know that. And there's a Latin phrase that I really enjoy, and it reads as follows: Vivat, crescat, floreat, which means may it live, grow, and flourish. I wish that for myself and for you as well. Self-responsibility. Basically, I think about self-responsibility as taking ownership over my thoughts, decisions, and actions, and everything that follows as a result. So I've come to adopt a perspective of radical responsibility over the things that happen in my life. And when I say radical, I mean that essentially everything in my life can be traced back to an action or a set of actions that I've taken at some point in my life in one way or another. And this has been a major transformative key in my life. Primarily, this is useful when I think about how my past has led to my current and how my current can lead to either my ideal future or an alternative. The main benefit of this approach is that it forces me to analyze my decisions and my behaviors in a more strategic and intentional way. Now, of course, I don't just blame myself for things that were outside of my control. In fact, it's not about placing blame at all. Rather, it's about asking myself, what actions and decisions led me here? Is there something I could have done to lead to a more favorable situation? And most importantly, what can I do in the future to avoid the unfavorable things from happening again, and what can I do instead to create a more favorable outcome in the future? So this involves seeing outcomes and situations in life through the most practical and actionable lens possible. And when I adopted this lens of radical self-responsibility over the things that occur in my life, it really enabled me to see how many favorable situations were within my power to attain just by adjusting my different behaviors, and the same thing with situations that I wanted to avoid. So for example, when it comes to managing my personal finances, there are two outcomes essentially. There's having more money in my future and having less or being in debt. Either way, I have to take responsibility over what happens, and there are behaviors that I can engage in that will lead me more in one direction or another. And just like with anything else on the show, that's a real example. So this happened in college on multiple accounts where I didn't have as much money as I'd like, or I was in debt. And I had to take responsibility for where I was because of my spending habits and because of my lack of my ability to track my finances where they were as I was moving along, and to budget. And this is just one example of where specifying an ideal really comes in handy. So for example, future Lev has money saved up, and he has an ability to control his spending habits, and he doesn't squander it based on a lack of control. So if I want to reach that ideal, I have to either act in a way that future Lev would act, or act in a way that maximizes the likelihood that I become like that future ideal. And that's just the first part of the equation. When we get to our conversation about self-accountability, I'll continue with this example. Now, an important note is that when I talk about radical responsibility, I don't mean traumatic experiences. This is a conversation that is much better had with a trusted individual or a mental health professional like a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a therapist, etc. I respect working through your stuff, and if this is relevant to you, then I wish you the best as you work through it. And note that when we apply this to personal growth and development, there's a really encouraging aspect to it. There's nearly infinite upside. When you stop simply hoping for external assistance and start putting in the necessary work in order to yield the results that we'd like to see, hope and faith become complementary rather than primary. You still have to put in the work. And don't get me wrong, hope and faith still have their place in this approach. However, only as long as we're putting in the work that is required in order to yield the results that we'd like to see. And I'll speak more on faith in the future. But, for example, it would be silly for me to expect to get a really good grade on a chemistry exam if I didn't spend the hours required studying or working on practice problems in order to get a good grade. And while some can do that, it's better to leave them as the exceptions rather than the rule. Self-accountability. Well, I view self-accountability as holding myself to my word, especially when it comes to future actions. So, while self-responsibility involves taking ownership over one's thoughts, decisions, and actions, self-accountability helps us stay on track. And it's a crucial step that's often missed. It's the most difficult because it requires consistency, and consistency requires work. To return to the previous example regarding personal finance management, I created and now use a finance tracker where I track every single cent that I spend. This way I can see exactly how I spend my money and on what, which enables me to course correct every week or month, etc. I have a budget for each category of spending, and I use conditional formatting to let me know when I spend too much money in one category or another. I also have a column for monthly savings in order to make sure it's factored in and that it actually occurs. Now, yes, this takes some time to set up, but once you set it up and get in the practice of updating it every week, it's a magnificent way to stay on top of your finances. When I started holding myself accountable to the items that require my attention through the use of lists and plans, which I'll get into in a moment, I noticed an explosive amount of growth. For simple things like getting a healthy amount of sleep each night, doing chores and running errands every week, and managing my personal finances. But also for more serious things, like keeping my word whenever I make commitments, communicating in a respectful tone when having a serious discussion, which is one of the standards that I hold myself to, and minimizing the amount of time that I spend not working while I'm on the clock. And now for a simple relation to the order framework. I realized that if I didn't hold myself to a higher standard when it came to my thoughts, decisions, and actions, then no step in the order framework would work as well as it should. So for example, holding myself accountable for making observations in my life, being responsible enough to realize if something's helping me move toward or away from my ideal future, learning how to be more decisive and to make better decisions that will help me improve my life, learning how to set proper goals, create plans to help me reach those goals, and improving the systems that I use to facilitate goal achievement, holding myself accountable for the execution of the action items specified in my plans, and finally, making it a practice to reflect as often as I can or is necessary to assess my progress and see what is working and what isn't. And now for some practical examples of how I keep myself accountable. To keep myself accountable, I use 3 different methods. First involves notebooks, lists, and trackers. I also use the help of others. And finally, I engage in self-communication. So I have many notebooks. I have a private journal. I have a notebook dedicated to my ideals and aspirations for my life, which I call the Book of Lev. I also, of course, have my work notebooks. I have a life admin notebook, a reflections notebook, a little book of ideas, and a few others. But for now, I'll only focus on the ones that are related to self-accountability. So in the Book of Lev, when I described identifying what I wanted future Lev's life to look like, I literally wrote it down. This notebook contains ideas about how I aim to act and behave, what I want my future relationships to look like, career goals, and a few other items. Future Lev, as specified in this notebook, is a very tangible character that I aspire to and am building towards every single day. Regarding my work notebook, I create to-do lists every single day. This way I set a plan and I check off items as I go. This helps me stay accountable for getting work done each day. It also has the side benefit of helping me stay organized and keep track of my different projects. I also have a life admin notebook where I record everything that requires my attention in my life for the week. This includes weekly errands that need to be completed, items from last week that still didn't get completed, as well as progress I'm making in areas of my life in which I've set goals. This gets filled out every single week. Usually. I also used to have a massive whiteboard in my living room, which was really helpful for keeping me on track. And now that I moved, I'm going to have to get another one. So you know what? I'll add that to my life admin notebook this week. Other people can be incredibly helpful when it comes to staying on track. I lean on family and friends whenever I need to get something done. Accountability partners really help you keep the motivation going, especially if you feel that you're struggling with keeping to your goals. I also do things like telling multiple friends that I'm going to start a podcast on personal growth and development, so I feel like I can't let them down. I love you, peeps. Setting a deadline and when I told them that I'd get the show started was really helpful as well. Deadlines work. And finally, self-communication. We become incredibly powerful when we understand what we think and how we think. Often, we underestimate the power our thoughts have in our lives. If we learn to understand our thoughts by listening to and engaging with them more, we can learn to direct them in a way that will be more beneficial both in the short term and the long term. So this helps me not only understand myself and identify potential limiting beliefs, but it also has the additional benefit of helping me to think and to speak critically. To make effective steps towards improving anything, first we have to observe the phenomenon in question. So in order to facilitate the observation of my thoughts, I engage in self-dialogue. And for me, self-dialogue either takes the form of journaling in one of my notebooks or, now I'm going to say something that'll make me seem a little crazy, but I'm okay with that. I talk to myself sometimes. And I do this because I'm not the best at having complex dialogue in my head. If you are, awesome. If not, try using a journal. I'm not formally recommending talking to yourself, but hey, whatever works for you. Just don't get caught doing it in public. The importance here is having some way of engaging with yourself and understanding your thought processes. We often don't even realize that we don't know what we actually think about different topics, or that our thoughts are simply absorbed from external circumstances without critique. So for me, this practice of self-dialogue helps me to identify, understand, and challenge my thoughts. It allows me to hold myself accountable for my thoughts. So when I know what I think, I can do one of a few things. I can ask myself, why do I think that? And it also has the side benefit of helping me become a more critical thinker by forcing me to flesh out an argument and also to play devil's advocate, which tends to lead to a deeper understanding. This can also help me to identify limiting beliefs. Say the following thought pops up in my head. I'm not a good reader, so I just won't read. Now that's a super limiting thought because a lot of valuable information can be found in books, and fortunately now there are audiobooks, but I personally love reading physical copies. To each their own. Now, if I set a goal to become a better reader or to read more, the self-dialogue then turns into something like, I haven't been good at reading in the past, but I know that it's a skill, and like any other skill, I can improve if I work on it. So how do I read more? Or how do I learn to read better? Or how do I read scientific articles? These are all genuine questions which have genuine answers. And so, like always, Google, YouTube, professionals, friends, and other resources are your friend. Think of AI. You know, the artificial intelligence that was modeled after human intelligence. The quality of the answer that you get is related to the quality of the question that you ask. Asking good questions is a skill. Learning how to ask yourself good questions is incredibly useful. Often, you'll be surprised at the answers that you receive. And if you don't have an answer, often that is an answer, which means that you need to seek external resources. Now, words have more power in our lives than we can ever truly grasp. That is, until we begin learning their power by observing our internal narratives and engaging with them. Then, we might notice how shifts in our internal dialogue and beliefs, due to that engagement, alters the reality that we experience. And this was something that I just had to try it and see what happened. I tried it, and now am a firm believer in the power that narratives play in our lives, both internal and external. But again, I'm mainly concerned with the internal when it comes to this major season in the show. And now to wrap up this conversation regarding self-responsibility and accountability by creating a relationship between those two concepts in the word discipline, which can be understood as self-control through the adherence to rules and standards of behavior. Now, understand that we're not talking about behavioral tactics in order to obtain self-control. In my experience, the necessary precursor for self-control, when it truly comes from within, is understanding that every action you take has consequences for your future. And placing myself in the driver's seat involved this sense of self-responsibility where I take control for everything that happens in my life. And I do provide some understanding that things do happen that are outside of my control, but I leave those as the exception rather than the rule as often as I can manage. Now, this sense of radical responsibility isn't an easy thing to adopt, and it's not even something that I'm recommending that others do in their lives. Rather, I'm relating to you that this is something that's led to real change in my life. Now, before I could develop an internal sense of what true discipline really looks like, I had to care about discipline in the first place, which was a natural result of taking ownership over my place in life, both current and future. So now that I've internalized that most, but not all things that happen to me in my life can be traced back to my decisions and actions in one form or another, and I've formed an idea of what I'd like to aspire to in my future, I hold myself accountable for behaving in ways that maximize the likelihood that I become like future Lev. Therefore, I created and continue to create structure in my life and establish standards for my thoughts, decisions, and behaviors in a way that favor the success of my endeavors. And I hold myself accountable to acting in accordance with these established standards. In a word, discipline. This is what is required for me to be in the driver's seat and to achieve what I'd like to in this life. To do what is required, when it's required, as required. Thank you very much for tuning in. This has been episode 5 of Level Up with Lev, where I discuss self-responsibility and self-accountability. If you like this episode, let me know. Leave a like down below. And if you have any thoughts, please leave a comment or reach out to me on any of the social media channels at Level Up with Lev or a slight variant. Thank you very much for tuning in this week. I appreciate your time and attention, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you again next week. Ciao.